Welcome to history's darkest secrets, where the forbidden past is finally unveiled. The night presses heavy over London. Rain lashes against the ancient stones, and the tower looms like a sentinel of death, its jagged silhouette cutting against a sky swollen with storm. A cold wind snakes through the battlements, carrying with it the faint toll of a distant church bell. To most Londoners, this sound is routine, but to those locked behind the fortress's walls, each strike is a cruel reminder that time itself is running out. For centuries, the Tower of London has been more than a prison. It has been a stage for England's darkest dramas, a place where power was displayed not through mercy, but through fear. To walk within its gates was to step into the pages of a silent book written in blood. Kings, queens, spies, and rebels, all have crossed its threshold, and few left alive to tell the tale. Its walls are thick not only with mortar and stone, but with the residue of whispered prayers and broken promises. The very name, the Tower, carried a weight heavy enough to break a man before the executioner's axe ever touched his neck. But if you pressed your hand against its cold surface, you might feel something unexpected: grooves carved by desperate fingers, names scratched by men who refused to vanish quietly. Graffiti, faint yet defiant, still lingers on its walls, a last, unyielding protest against oblivion. These marks are ghosts in stone, each one a voice saying, "I was here. I resisted. I mattered." Yet even within such shadows of despair, rumors always flickered, rumors of escape. They were rare, and often unbelievable. The Tower's reputation was as much weapon as fortress, designed to convince the world that resistance was futile. To even imagine freedom was to imagine madness. But what if, against all odds, a prisoner sentenced to death simply walked out of this labyrinth of chains and soldiers? What if the Tower, feared across Christendom as unbreakable, was tricked by nothing more than wit and courage? That prisoner was William Maxwell, 5th Earl of Nithsdale, a Jacobite noble, a condemned traitor, a man whose life was supposed to end in a spectacle of blood. And yet, he would become one of the most unlikely figures ever to defeat the Tower. Not with swords. Not with bribes. But with a deception so audacious, it still haunts the fortress's legend 300 years later. This is not just the tale of a man's escape. It is the tale of a love that refused surrender, of a woman's courage that outwitted a king, and of a fortress whose myth of impregnability was shattered in one cold, storm-drenched night. And so, the story begins, not with the sound of battle, but with the slow turning of a heavy iron key, echoing in a corridor of stone. Behind that door, in the flickering light of a single candle, sits William Maxwell. His face is lined with fatigue, his eyes haunted but unbroken. On the walls around him, the ghostly etchings of forgotten prisoners remind him of what awaits: silence, execution, oblivion. Yet tonight those same walls will witness something else: defiance, brilliance, and the audacity of escape. The year is 1715. Britain stands at a crossroads, its throne occupied by a stranger. Queen Anne is dead, the last monarch of the House of Stuart. With no living heirs, the line that had ruled England and Scotland for centuries has collapsed. By the Act of Settlement of 1701, the Crown bypasses dozens of closer Catholic claimants to land on the head of a distant relative, George of Hanover, a German prince who scarcely speaks a word of English. For many, this is no smooth succession. It is a betrayal, a violation of divine order, a theft of legitimacy itself. To the Jacobites, loyalists to the Stuart cause, the true king is James Edward Francis Stuart, son of the exiled James II, known to his enemies as the Old Pretender. Their belief is not only political but spiritual. To them, monarchy is ordained by God, and the blood of the Stuarts carries a sacred claim that no act of parliament can erase. The land seethes with tension. In taverns and churches, whispers grow louder: should a foreigner, an outsider with foreign manners, rule over England, Scotland, and Ireland? George I's arrival is met with suspicion, even ridicule. He leans heavily on his Whig ministers, alienates his Tory opposition, and treats his own family with cold disdain. He imprisons his wife. He distrusts his son, the Prince of Wales, who quickly becomes a rallying figure for discontent. A king who cannot trust his own household can scarcely expect loyalty from his kingdom. And then, rebellion breaks. In the north, banners are raised for James Stuart. Men march under the cross of St. Andrew, proclaiming their defiance. The Jacobite rebellion of 1715 surges with hope, desperation, and the conviction that the Stuart line can be restored. The rebellion is more than muskets and steel, it is a clash of identities. It pits Protestant succession against Catholic loyalty, Parliament's authority against the old notion of divine right. It is a gamble to rewrite Britain's destiny. For George I, this is not just another uprising. It is a dagger pointed at the very heart of his rule. His crown is fragile, his legitimacy questioned, and his every misstep scrutinized. The rebellion becomes a mirror of his fears. If the Jacobites succeed, his kingship will be exposed as a foreign illusion, his throne nothing but a borrowed seat waiting to be reclaimed. This fragile insecurity explains much of what follows. When William Maxwell is captured, when the rebellion fails, George I will see not only a traitor, but a living symbol of everything that threatens him. To lose Maxwell, to see him slip away from the tower's walls, will not simply be an escape. It will be humiliation, a personal insult that strikes at the very core of his authority. The fury that erupts from the king in the days to come cannot be understood without first grasping this moment in time, a kingdom aflame, a monarch insecure, and a cause that refuses to die. Among the Jacobite nobles who rose in 1715, one name carried both weight and tragedy: William Maxwell, the 5th Earl of Nithsdale. Born in 1676 into an ancient Scottish Catholic family, he was raised in a world where faith and loyalty were not simply private virtues but matters of survival. In a kingdom that increasingly aligned itself with Protestant succession, to be openly Catholic was to walk a dangerous line between honor and treason. From his youth, William was shaped by conviction. At just 21, he secretly journeyed to the court of the exiled James II in Saint-Germain, pledging himself to the Stuart cause. This act was more than political posturing. It was a vow, a declaration that his loyalty lay not with the shifting tides of Parliament but with the bloodline he believed God had appointed to rule. To him, the Hanoverian succession was not just an error of politics, it was a violation of divine order, a usurpation that cried out for resistance. The uprising of 1715 was his moment. When banners of rebellion were unfurled, Maxwell was among the first to raise his standard. He rallied men not for wealth or self-advancement, but for principle. For him, this was not a war for territory but for legitimacy itself, for the rightful king, for the faith he cherished, for a cause larger than his own survival. In his eyes, he was no traitor. He was a loyal subject, serving the king history had unjustly cast aside. Yet loyalty can be both virtue and curse. The rebellion faltered, crushed beneath the disciplined weight of the government's armies. For William, defeat was not only military but spiritual. It was the collapse of a dream he had nurtured since youth, a cause sanctified in his heart. To fall into the hands of George I's men was, for him, to be delivered into the grasp of everything he despised, a throne he saw as stolen, a monarch he saw as illegitimate, a justice system designed not to weigh fairness but to silence dissent. As he was marched to London in chains, he must have felt the bitter irony. He had fought for loyalty, for the crown he believed was true, and yet now that same word, loyalty, would be wielded against him, twisted into treason. The state would brand him a rebel, a traitor, an enemy of order. History, however, would remember him differently, as a man of allegiance, one whose faith and honor were unshaken even when the price of conviction was death. This is the backdrop of his imprisonment in the Tower, not a rogue caught in crime, but a nobleman who believed he had done his duty, a man prepared to pay with his life for a cause that had defined him from youth. What follows is not just an escape story, but the last chapter in the struggle of a man whose identity was inseparable from the Stuart claim. The rebellion collapsed at Preston. William Maxwell, Earl of Nithsdale, was captured with other Jacobite leaders and branded with the gravest of charges, high treason. His sentence would be decided in London, and so his fate carried him to the most dreaded fortress in the kingdom, the Tower of London. For centuries, the Tower had loomed as both a prison and a warning. Tales of its dungeons and torture chambers made it a place where despair itself seemed to have been built into the walls. From the vanished princes in the Tower to the decapitated in Bullen, it was a monument to fear. Yet the reality within was not uniform. The Tower was no ordinary jailhouse of chains and straw, it was a political prison and status-dictated experience. The poor and forgotten might rot in dark, rat-infested cells, but the noble and wealthy often found themselves living in what could almost be called constrained comfort. Sir Walter Raleigh had been allowed his own garden, even books, during his long confinement. John Balliol, a former king of Scotland, had kept his wife, his servants, and even his hunting dogs during his years within the walls. The Tower did not crush all prisoners equally, it graded their suffering according to their station. William Maxwell, as an earl, would have received these privileges. His cell was not a dripping medieval oubliette, but a chamber with a bed, a desk, and the ability to receive visitors. He could write letters, pray with his confessor, and speak with family and friends. He was deprived of liberty, but not of dignity. Yet in that dignity lay the Tower's blind spot, a weakness invisible to its keepers. For noble prisoners were watched less closely. Guards became accustomed to the coming and going of wives, servants, and acquaintances. What seemed harmless, a nobleman's comfort, a lady's visit, would soon become the chink in the tower's armor. For William, the irony must have been bitter. He had been captured with a sword in hand, but it was not steel that would offer his only chance of freedom. It was the very system meant to contain him, the polite courtesies extended to men of rank, that would become the cage's greatest flaw. The tower's stone walls were strong, but its assumptions about class and order were fragile. And so, as William settled into his gilded confinement, despair hung over him. The rebellion was crushed. His allies were scattered. His name was written on the king's death lists. The tower had swallowed countless men like him before. Few had emerged alive. Yet the Earl of Nithsdale's fate would not be sealed by these walls. His salvation was already moving toward him, across frozen roads and winter storms, in the form of a woman whose will would prove stronger than any stone or iron key. The trial was no true trial at all. For men like William Maxwell, charged with high treason, the verdict was already written before the court convened. The rebellion had been defeated, the Jacobite cause publicly humiliated, and the crown hungered for vengeance. The scaffold would serve as the final stage on which loyalty to the Stuarts was punished, not debated. Maxwell, with other captured leaders, stood accused in Westminster Hall beneath the gaze of judges who acted more as executioners than arbiters of justice. His plea for clemency carried no weight. He was not a man being tried, he was a message being crafted, a warning to every Jacobite in Britain. And so the sentence was read with brutal clarity: death by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was the most dreadful of all punishments, designed to annihilate not only the body but the very memory of the condemned. First, he would be dragged to the place of execution. Then hanged, cut down alive, his entrails torn from him and burned before his eyes. Finally, his body would be quartered, the pieces displayed to the public as a grisly deterrent. This was not justice, it was theater, a ritual of power designed to terrify a nation. The date was set, February 24, 1716. The clock began its pitiless countdown. Each toll of the city's bells, each turn of the sun, brought Maxwell closer to that scaffold. His cell in the tower, with its flickering candlelight and etched graffiti, became a waiting room for death. He spent his final days writing letters, putting his affairs in order, and preparing his soul for the journey he believed awaited him beyond the executioner's hand. Yet despair did not belong to William alone. Beyond the prison walls, the news spread. Crowds murmured of the nobleman's fate, some with satisfaction, others with pity. To Jacobite sympathizers, it was a tragedy, to loyalists, a necessary punishment. But for one person, it was neither tragedy nor justice, it was an intolerable wrong. William may have resigned himself to death. The king had claimed his body, the rebellion had claimed his hope. But the story of the Earl of Nithsdale did not end in Westminster Hall. Because fate had already chosen another player to step onto the stage, a woman whose love and defiance would ignite one of history's most daring rescues. When word reached Scotland that William Maxwell had been condemned, his wife, Winifred Herbert Maxwell, did not collapse into mourning. She did not retreat into grief, nor did she accept the grim certainty of widowhood. Instead, she mounted a horse and set her face toward London, determined to defy the fate that the king himself had decreed. It was the heart of winter. The roads were choked with snow, the winds lashed bitterly across the highlands, and the long miles to London were dangerous even in kinder seasons. Yet Winifred pressed on, riding through nights that froze her fingers to the reins, through villages where whispers of betrayal and rebellion followed her, through landscapes where Jacobite sympathies could be as perilous as government suspicion. Each mile was not merely a test of endurance, but a declaration of her will. She would not allow her husband to die alone, nor without a fight. Winifred was no ordinary woman of her age. Born into the Catholic Herbert family, she had grown up with faith and resilience woven into her identity. She understood the risks of her journey, the dangers of stepping into the heart of London at a time when Jacobite loyalties were punished with brutality. But her courage overrode caution. She was not riding to plead for comfort. She was riding to challenge a king. When at last she reached the capital, she did not arrive as a figure of quiet despair. She arrived as a strategist, already calculating her next move. Her presence in London was itself an act of rebellion, a symbol of defiance at a moment when George I sought to crush every trace of Jacobite resistance. While others may have pitted her as a doomed wife, Winifred saw herself as something very different, a commander entering hostile territory with one singular mission: to wrench her husband from the jaws of death. Her journey across frozen miles was not just a physical trial. It was the crucible in which her resolve was forged. By the time she crossed the gates of London, she had already defied expectation, already proven that her will could outlast storm, distance, and fear. Now, only the king himself stood between her and her husband's life. Winifred's first step was the most obvious: appeal directly to the monarch himself. If the king could be persuaded, if mercy could be won at the highest throne, then her husband's life might yet be spared. And so, dressed not as a conspirator but as a grieving wife, she entered the glittering halls of royal power. King George I received her coldly. He was a foreign king ruling a suspicious land, and to him Winifred was not merely a wife, she was the embodiment of the Jacobite threat, living proof of a rebellion that had dared to contest his throne. Still, she knelt before him, her petition in hand, and begged for her husband's life. Her words were humble, her body bowed low, but her spirit burned with desperation. The court fell silent as she clutched at the king's coat, refusing to let go until he heard her plea. But George was not moved. He had no intention of granting mercy to a man he considered a traitor, nor to a woman whose very presence reminded him of his fragile legitimacy. With a violent gesture, he dragged her across the floor, pulling free of her grasp. The scene was humiliating, brutal in its symbolism, the king casting aside not only a woman, but the Jacobite cause itself. For Winifred, that moment marked a transformation. Until then, she had come as a supplicant, appealing to justice, appealing to the monarch's sense of humanity. But justice was denied, and humanity was absent. George's cruelty burned away the last hope of pardon. Her husband's salvation would never come from royal mercy. It would come only from her own cunning. What began as a plea ended as a declaration of war, not with weapons, but with wits. Winifred left the king's presence humiliated, but not broken. If the tower was a fortress of stone, George had just exposed the cracks within it: arrogance, blindness, and the underestimation of a woman's resolve. From that moment, she was no longer a grieving wife. She was a strategist, a conspirator, and soon, the architect of one of the most astonishing prison breaks in history. The king's rejection left Winifred with only one path forward: she would have to take her husband's life into her own hands. The tower was built to withstand armies, yet she knew it was not armies that would undo it. It would be deception, carefully woven through the overlooked spaces of human routine. Winifred began to assemble a small circle of allies, women who shared both her courage and her loyalty. There was Mrs. Mills, a stout woman whose figure would prove vital to the scheme, Mrs. Morgan, and the faithful servant Cecilia Evans. They were not soldiers, not spies, but ordinary women who understood that extraordinary risks were the only hope left. Her plan was audacious in its simplicity: disguise her husband as one of them and smuggle him out of the tower beneath the guards' very eyes. It was a plan that relied not on force but on perception, on the guards' assumptions of what they saw, and more importantly, what they never expected to see. In the 18th century, women were rarely viewed as dangerous. Their comings and goings in the tower, especially when tied to noble prisoners, were routine. They wept, they prayed, they carried messages of comfort. Guards accustomed to such scenes paid them little mind. Winifred understood this blind spot with razor clarity. Where a man might arouse suspicion, a grieving woman passed almost invisibly. In this prejudice lay the key to freedom. But this was no crude masquerade. The plan unfolded like a theatrical production, with each woman playing a part. One would draw attention with dramatic weeping. Another would exit the cell, feigning illness, distracting the guards. Meanwhile, inside, William Maxwell would be remade. His beard concealed, his face painted, his body draped in layers of fabric and cloaks that disguised his frame. The fashion of the age, wide skirts, heavy shawls, artificial headdresses, became, in Winifred's hands, a weapon more potent than steel. Timing would be everything. The attempt had to be made on the eve of execution, when emotions ran high and the tower was most accustomed to visits of grief. The guards, expecting nothing but tears, would themselves become actors in Winifred's play, unwitting participants in their own deception. It was a plan of desperation, yes. But also of genius. Winifred understood that the strongest walls can be toppled not by force, but by turning the minds of those who guard them. The tower had prepared for blades, bribes, and battles. It had never prepared for the quiet cunning of a woman's resolve. On the eve of February 23, the tower's stones held their breath. The condemned man was scheduled to die the following morning, his name already etched in the ritual of execution. But inside his chamber, history was about to be rewritten. Winifred Maxwell and her companions arrived dressed in heavy winter cloaks, their faces half hidden in the gloom. To the guards, it was nothing more than a final farewell: grieving women come to pray and weep at a doomed man's side. Inside the cell, however, the scene was not of mourning but transformation. William Maxwell, the proud earl condemned to a traitor's death, was being unmade and remade. Mrs. Mills removed her own outer garments, passing them piece by piece to disguise the man who only hours earlier had been resigned to the scaffold. A wide gown of dark fabric hid the breadth of his shoulders. A voluminous cloak swallowed the line of his body. An artificial headdress concealed his hair, while heavy powder and rouge softened the sharpness of his features. Even his beard, impossible to erase, was blurred beneath layers of makeup, shadowed into anonymity. Every movement was frantic but precise. Ribbons were tied, skirts arranged, handkerchiefs pressed over the mouth as if in mourning. The disguise was a fragile miracle, dependent not only on cloth and powder but on the expectations of the men outside. For in that era, a woman's clothing was more than modesty, it was armor. The towering gowns, the layered petticoats, the deep hoods and scarves, all of them built a silhouette so imposing that it became a shield of invisibility. Within it, the condemned earl vanished. In his place stood a silent, veiled figure, neither lord nor prisoner, but simply one more woman overcome with grief. The air inside the cell was charged with terror. A single cough, a trembling hand, a misstep, and the ruse would collapse. The women whispered instructions, adjusted a cloak here, a ribbon there. Outside, guards shifted, their boots echoing on the stone floors. The clock ticked closer to midnight. It was theater of the highest stakes. And William Maxwell, now hidden in plain sight, stood at the threshold of life and death. If the deception held, he would step beyond the tower's gates a free man. If it faltered, the punishment would be swifter, crueler, and shared by all who dared conspire. At last, the preparations were complete. A nobleman had been transformed into a shadow, a ghost draped in woman's attire. And in that moment the tower's reputation as impregnable faltered, not by force of arms, but by the quiet genius of disguise. The hour had come. The disguise was in place, the plan rehearsed only in whispers, and now William Maxwell, once a condemned earl, now a veiled woman, stood at the threshold of his cell. The tower, that fortress of certainty, was about to be tested by a silence more powerful than steel. The first act of deception unfolded with practiced subtlety. One of Winifred's companions feigned illness and stumbled from the chamber, pressing a handkerchief to her face, wailing with convincing despair. The guards, long accustomed to such scenes, barely looked up. The evening before an execution was always heavy with grief. They expected women to weep, to tremble, to retreat in fits of anguish. Nothing in this scene struck them as unusual. Moments later, another figure emerged from the cell, head bowed, face concealed beneath a cloak, steps deliberate yet unremarkable. To the guards, it was merely another grieving woman leaving the condemned man's side. To history, it was William Maxwell, walking the razor's edge between life and death. Every step was perilous. The weight of the cloak seemed suddenly unbearable, the silence of the corridor deafening. Each shadow might conceal suspicion, each flicker of candlelight might betray a glimpse of his face. William's heart must have pounded like a drum against the fabric pressed tight across his chest. He did not dare speak. He did not dare stumble. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if grief itself guided his steps. The guards barely looked. Their eyes slid past the cloaked figure, distracted by the muffled sobs of the women still inside. In that moment, the tower's greatest strength, its reputation for vigilance, became its weakness. The soldiers expected plots with swords, ropes, or bribes. They did not expect a nobleman to slip past them draped in the modest garments of womanhood. And so William passed through the inner passages of the tower like a phantom. A condemned man walking freely, unseen because no one dared imagine what they were truly seeing. He was not William Maxwell in their eyes, he was simply another shadow among many, another mourner in a night filled with sorrow. Step by step, the impossible was becoming real. The Earl of Nithsdale was leaving the tower, not in chains, not dragged to the scaffold, but walking quietly into the night, a ghost who had already defied a king. The door closed behind William Maxwell. Outside, he walked as a shadow toward freedom. Inside, in the dim candlelight of the cell, Winifred remained, her heart racing, yet her face composed. The success of the plan did not end with his departure. If suspicion arose too quickly, if the guards checked the chamber, William's fragile head start would vanish. To protect him, Winifred had to play the most dangerous role of her life. She sat where her husband had sat, bowed in apparent devotion. When a servant entered to light the candles, she answered calmly, her voice softened into a low murmur of prayer. She spoke loudly enough that, to passing ears, it seemed her husband himself was in communion with God, unwilling to be disturbed. She disguised not her body, but her voice, mimicking the cadence of William's speech, steady and convincing. In those tense hours, she became her husband's echo. The deception required not only courage but nerves of iron. Every creak of the door, every shuffle of footsteps in the corridor threatened to unmask her. Guards might at any moment demand to see the condemned man, to confirm he still sat awaiting his death. But Winifred did not falter. She prayed aloud, she whispered, she moved within the cell with deliberate confidence, sustaining the illusion that William was still there, silent, devout, resigned. Hours stretched into an eternity. Outside, the tower settled into uneasy slumber. Inside, Winifred fought a battle of endurance, holding the lie together with nothing but her own will. She was alone now, her allies gone, her husband fleeing into the night. Yet she bore the weight of the entire conspiracy on her shoulders. If she failed, all would be lost. At last, dawn crept toward the city. The execution hour loomed. And still Winifred held the ruse intact, buying William the most precious currency of all, time. Time to slip farther from London, time to elude the manhunt that would surely follow. History often remembers escapes for the daring of the fugitive, but here the greater courage belonged to the one who stayed behind. Winifred had not only devised the plan, she had risked discovery by remaining in the very heart of danger. In that long night, she was both prisoner and protector, her voice the thin veil between triumph and catastrophe. When the tower finally realized the truth, it was too late. The Earl of Nithsdale was already beyond its walls, and the woman who had outwitted a king stood calm amidst the storm she herself had unleashed. Morning broke over London with grim purpose. It was the day of execution, and already the city stirred with anticipation. Crowds prepared to witness the grisly spectacle promised by law, the dismemberment of traitors, the triumph of royal justice. But within the tower, as the first light seeped through the narrow windows, a terrible realization dawned: the condemned Earl of Nithsdale was gone. Panic spread like fire through dry straw. Guards stormed the corridors, their boots thundering against stone floors. Orders were shouted, doors flung open, chambers searched in disbelief. How could a man vanish from a fortress believed to be impregnable? Each officer who inspected the empty cell felt the same chill: they had been fooled, and the tower's reputation had been mocked. The news reached King George I swiftly. To the public, he affected a veneer of composure. For a man in my lord's situation, he is reported to have said, it was the very best thing he could have done. Outwardly, he pretended to shrug, as if the escape of a condemned rebel were an amusing twist of fate. But in private, the mask cracked. Behind closed doors, George seethed. He raged that Winifred Maxwell had done him more harm than any woman in Christendom. His fury was not only at the insult of a fugitive slipping through his fingers, it was at the humiliation of being outwitted by a woman he had personally scorned. For a king whose crown sat uneasily on his brow, the escape was not just an inconvenience. It was an open wound. Every fear he carried about his reign, that he was seen as foreign, unloved, illegitimate, bled into his anger. The tower, symbol of royal strength, had been made a laughingstock. His justice, meant to terrify the Jacobite cause into silence, had been mocked by cleverness and disguise. This was no ordinary failure, it was a spectacle of incompetence that echoed across Europe. And so, wrath consumed him. He demanded answers. He demanded arrests. He demanded that the tower be scoured and every accomplice hunted down. The escape was to be avenged, not merely for the sake of order, but for the wounded pride of a monarch who feared at every turn that his throne might slip away. The king's fury would transform the next chapter of the story. What had begun as one woman's act of courage would now provoke a deadly pursuit, a manhunt driven not by justice but by humiliation. And in the days to come, the question would hang heavy in the air: could the Earl of Nithsdale remain a ghost long enough to escape the king's wrath? The tower was in uproar. Messengers galloped from London, carrying orders of pursuit to every road and port. The king's command was clear: find the fugitive. No expense would be spared, no mercy given to anyone suspected of helping him. The Earl of Nithsdale had slipped through the walls of England's most secure prison, and George I demanded blood to wash away his shame. But William Maxwell was already gone, transformed into a shadow. The night of his escape, he was led quietly through the city, hidden in plain sight by the network of Jacobite sympathizers who had risked everything to protect him. Disguised now in a servant's garb, Venetian livery that rendered him unrecognizable, he moved from one safe house to another, shielded by loyal friends whose names history rarely remembers. London itself was a maze of danger. Soldiers patrolled the streets, taverns buzzed with rumors, and every carriage was watched. Yet in the chaos lay his advantage. The guards were searching for an earl, a nobleman in disguise perhaps, but still bearing the weight of rank. They did not see the quiet servant slipping past them with downcast eyes, his silence his greatest defense. Meanwhile, Winifred was no less bold. Having secured the family estate for their son, she too prepared to leave England. The king's men scoured the land for her as well, for she was no longer simply a wife, she was the mastermind of the Tower's humiliation. To capture her would be to avenge the insult. Yet she eluded them, her movements careful, her resolve unbroken. The manhunt spread across the countryside. Inns were raided, roads watched, ships inspected. Whispers of treachery and betrayal hung in the air. But the Jacobite cause, though defeated on the battlefield, still lived in the loyalty of its adherents. Quiet households opened their doors, sympathizers passed secret messages, and the fugitive nobleman moved ever closer to the coast. The escape was no longer merely a family struggle. It had become a silent victory for the Jacobite movement itself, proof that even in defeat, defiance could humiliate the crown. To George I, this was intolerable. To his enemies, it was inspiration. Step by step, day by day, William Maxwell slipped farther from the reach of the king's fury. The deadly hunt thundered behind him, but the ghost of the Tower pressed forward, carried by faith, loyalty, and the quiet courage of those who believed his cause was not yet dead. At last, the hunted earl slipped through England's tightening grasp. From London's alleyways to secret safe houses, he had been smuggled with care and cunning. Now, cloaked in anonymity, he reached the coast. The Channel stretched before him, grey and restless, a final barrier between captivity and freedom. To cross it was to step out of George I's realm, beyond the reach of English justice. Somewhere in the dark hold of a vessel, William Maxwell waited, not as an earl, not as a condemned traitor, but as a fugitive clinging to silence. The sea spray beat against the hull, and the creak of timber marked the passing hours. With every wave, he drifted farther from the scaffold that had been prepared for him, farther from the Tower whose walls had failed to hold him. By dawn, the white cliffs of England would fade into mist, and the coast of France would rise like salvation. Soon after, Winifred followed. She had stayed behind long enough to secure the family estate for their son, ensuring that what little remained of their legacy would not be swallowed by confiscation. Her own journey was fraught with danger, for the king's agents scoured the roads and ports for her as eagerly as for her husband. Yet she too crossed the waters, eluding the net cast for her. And in France, the two were reunited, husband and wife, fugitive and liberator, bound together by the most daring act of love and defiance their age had ever seen. But exile is never merely escape. In France and later in Rome, the Maxwells were welcomed into the circle of the exiled Stuart court. Their survival was not just personal relief, it was a statement. Among the Jacobites, their story became legend, a whispered tale of triumph against impossible odds. In gatherings lit by candlelight, in toasts raised quietly among loyalists, the escape of the Earl of Nithsdale was celebrated as a victory where armies had failed. William and Winifred were no longer simply fugitives. They were living symbols, proof that the Stuart cause, though broken on the battlefield, had not been extinguished. Their presence at court was a constant reminder that even George I, with all his armies and prisons, could not command absolute obedience. Thus their lives in exile became more than survival. They became a kind of defiance, lived each day as testimony that the crown could not silence loyalty, nor erase the power of devotion. Across the Channel, the Maxwells carved a new destiny, beyond the gallows prepared for them, yet forever marked by the night they outwitted a king. The Tower of London was built to be inescapable, yet history proves that no fortress is without cracks. Across the centuries, a handful of prisoners had managed to defy its walls, each in their own daring way. Their stories were remembered not just for the freedom they won, but for the audacity of their attempts, men who challenged the very myth of the Tower's impregnability. In 1101, Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham and the Tower's first recorded escapee, achieved freedom not with steel but with drink. He plied his guards with wine until they collapsed in stupor, then slipped down a rope smuggled to him in a cask. His escape was bold and simple, a trick of intoxication and nerve. 2 centuries later, in 1323, Roger Mortimer, rebel, traitor, and future power behind the throne, used a more elaborate scheme. He drugged his guards with a noxious potion, then crept through the crumbling kitchens of the Tower. With rope ladders, he descended to the riverbank and vanished into the night. His was an escape born of collaboration and decay, exploiting both human weakness and the Tower's failing stone. In 1597, John Gerard, a Jesuit priest imprisoned and tortured, showed a different kind of brilliance. With hands still mangled from the rack, he wrote secret letters in invisible ink made from orange juice. Through these communications, he arranged his freedom. One night, a rope stretched across the moat to a waiting boat, and he slid across, a broken body propelled by unbroken faith. His was not only escape, but resurrection. And then, in 1716, William Maxwell. His escape was unlike the others. He did not bribe, he did not drug, he did not climb. He did not rely on broken stones or secret ropes. He walked. Cloaked in the garments of a woman, veiled by the assumptions of his guards, he passed silently through the tower's very heart. What set the Nithsdale escape apart was not daring alone, but psychology. It was not the tower's walls that were breached, but its mind. Winifred Maxwell understood what none of the keepers could imagine, that a nobleman could disappear beneath lace and fabric, that the grief of women could be weaponized as camouflage. In an age when women were dismissed as fragile and powerless, she used that blindness as her shield. Thus the escape of William Maxwell stands as the most ingenious of them all, a masterpiece not of force, but of perception. Where others bent the tower through violence or trickery, Winifred shattered it with wit and courage. The tower had been deceived by its own prejudices, undone not by its strength but by its weakness, the arrogance of believing it could not be fooled. In the long chronicle of escapes, none cuts so deeply to the heart of power's illusion. The Nithsdales did not just flee the tower. They humiliated it. The story of William and Winifred Maxwell is more than a tale of escape. It is a reminder that history is not always written by armies or kings, but sometimes by those who refuse to surrender when surrender seems inevitable. In the cold heart of the tower, where hope had been extinguished for countless souls, a woman's determination rekindled it, and in doing so, she defied a monarch and rewrote her family's fate. The Tower of London still stands today, its walls heavy with centuries of blood and silence. Tourists walk its corridors, staring at carvings left by desperate hands, wondering at the ghosts that linger there. And among those ghosts, one story endures above all, the night when the Fortress of Kings was fooled not by force, but by love. William Maxwell, who should have died in agony before a jeering crowd, instead lived out his days in exile. In Rome, he and Winifred served the court of the exiled Stuarts, their presence itself a quiet act of rebellion. Winifred even became governess to members of the Stuart household, her courage still shaping the cause for which her husband had risked his life. Together, they transformed from condemned traitors into living symbols of defiance, their survival a constant reminder that George I's grip on power was not absolute. But it is not merely politics that gives their tale its power. It is the love that burned at its core. Winifred Maxwell could have mourned, could have accepted widowhood and resigned herself to her fate. Instead, she chose action. She crossed frozen roads, defied a king to his face, outwitted the guards of the most infamous prison in the realm, and risked her own life in the tower to buy her husband time. Hers was not a supporting role, it was the central act. She was the architect, the heroine, the mastermind who turned despair into victory. Their story endures because it speaks to something timeless, the idea that courage and devotion can overcome the seemingly impossible. The tower's walls may have been thick, its locks strong, its guards watchful. But none of that could withstand the resolve of one woman who refused to let her husband die. And so, when we speak of the Tower of London, of its legends of cruelty, its echoes of death, we must also remember the defiance carved into its shadow. The night an earl walked out disguised as a woman, and a king was left to rage against the brilliance of a love he could not break. History is often remembered for its wars and its rulers. But sometimes, its truest legacy belongs to those who simply would not yield. William and Winifred Maxwell's escape remains not just a tale of rebellion, but a testament that love, courage, and wit can outmatch even the might of kings.
Thank you for watching History's Darkest Secrets. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more forbidden history.